A missing theater, an opening day ride that wasn't always here, and a secret location. This corner is home to Fantasyland's greatest design secret. Brickey here, telling you the story of Fantasyland's missing theater and how it changed Disneyland forever. Hey friends, before we get started today, if you want to keep learning about all of Disneyland's hidden design secrets, make sure you subscribe to the channel. That's the best way to do what we do on this channel. We study Disneyland's past so we can better predict the future. Let's go. You've probably seen it 100 times, the opening day broadcast of Disneyland, the live television event that introduced Walt's park to the entire world. It's classic Walt, instantly making people feel nostalgic for something that was brand new. But tucked inside that familiar footage is a moment most people have never really noticed. I'll be honest, I didn't think about it till I started working on this video. When the cameras cut to Fantasyland, the announcer proudly points out Mickey and Minnie heading into a brand new attraction, the Mickey Mouse Club Theater. And then, seconds later, out pour the Mouseketeers, 25 kids in Western outfits, smiling, waving, and introducing themselves to America. But here's the trick. None of this was real yet. The theater wasn't open to guests. The Mickey Mouse Club hadn't even premiered on television. No one watching at home knew what in the world a Mouseketeer was. But Walt did. He knew he'd have the largest TV audience he'd ever get. And he used that stage to quietly launch his next project, a children's television show that would keep Disneyland's magic alive long after opening day. And the most ambitious part? Monday through Friday. This was a lot to add on Disney's plate. It was a masterclass in cross-promotion before that term ever existed. Walt was using Disneyland not just to entertain guests, but to advertise his company's future. Every camera angle was working double time, half for the audience at Disneyland and the other half for the millions watching at home. And when you realize this, you start to see both Disneyland and the special very differently. From its very first day, it wasn't just a theme park, it was a marketing machine, designed by a man willing to risk everything and needed this gamble to pay off. So he used every creative trick he could to make sure it would succeed. Walt wasn't just opening a park that day, he was selling the idea to the entire world. And he did it with a theater that didn't even exist yet. If you walked into Fantasyland in 1955, you may not have noticed the Mickey Mouse Club Theater, tucked beside Snow White's dark ride. It wasn't flashy, no spinning elephants, no music blaring into the midway, just a bright facade with big block letters promoting all talking and singing sound films. That line might seem ordinary now, but in 1955, it was a brag. While the Main Street Cinema was showing silent Mickey cartoons like it was 1929. Fantasyland was the future, a fully air-conditioned theater showing color, sound, and even the first 3D film that Disney would ever create. This was the only place in the park where you could sit down, cool off, and see Mickey Mouse exactly as he looked in the movie theaters, in full Technicolor glory. It opened that August, just weeks after Disneyland itself. 30 minutes of shorts would loop every half hour. 3 cartoons, sometimes stitched into themes. A Mickey reel, a Donald reel, or maybe even a Western starring Goofy or Pecos Bill. If you were lucky, you might catch the Mickey Mouse Club 3D Jamboree in 1956, starring the actual Mouseketeers, and that's what made this place so smart. On the surface, it was a break spot for families. A simple B ticket when everybody else was running off for those E-ticket thrills. But underneath, built in, was Walt's media machine. You see, the same kids America watched after school were performing right here, live on stage at Disneyland. The park and the TV show were feeding one another. Even the projection format was practical genius. The theater was small enough to run 16mm prints. Easy to swap, easy to update. That meant Disney could refresh the lineup constantly. Today's cartoon could be next week's new program. It kept the attraction relevant without ever rebuilding it. For over 25 years, this little theater quietly did its job. keeping Walt's cartoons alive inside his park. It may have been one of the most overlooked buildings inside of opening day Fantasyland. However, this building represented one of the most innovative designs this land would possess in its early decades. This again is one of those moments where Walt Disney is predicting the future. By the mid-60s, the Mickey Mouse Club had ended its run on television, and the little theater in Fantasyland quietly dropped its original name. It simply became the Fantasyland Theater, but instead of fading away, it found an entirely new purpose. The cartoons still played, but the projector wasn't the star anymore. The theater had become a gathering place, a small stage that connected Disneyland to the culture all around it. One weekend might bring a Donald Duck festival, complete with parades down Main Street and free autograph photos for the kids. Another weekend might be Pooh Days, where families lined up to meet Winnie the Pooh himself, while Blustery Day played inside the theater on a constant loop. And sometimes the focus wasn't Disneyland characters at all. There were cultural events like Festival Mexico, where more than 100 musicians and dancers from Mexico filled the park performing on stages across Disneyland. And inside the Fantasyland Theater, guests could watch
Free Gay Caballeros
while surrounded by the live mariachis outside. Other weekends would feature gospel choirs, children's events, because there was a Children's Day at Disneyland. That seems kind of wild to me. Isn't every day a Children's Day at Disneyland? Including a famous French puppeteer, André Tahoun, don't speak French, who performed to packed audiences. This was allegedly like a huge deal. They ran ads everywhere, did a stage build out, like this guy was a big deal in the world of puppets. And when Disneyland celebrated milestones like its 25th anniversary or 50 years of Walt Disney Productions, the Fantasyland Theater became a flex space inside of Fantasyland. Commercials were filmed here, cast members previewed new television specials and got private screenings. It was small, but it was the park's early day media center. And all of this tells you something about Disneyland in those years. It wasn't the unstoppable brand that it is today. There were seasons when attendance dipped, and the company had to think locally, keep the community engaged, keep the turnstiles moving. Disney could celebrate culture, showcase talent, and remind families that the little park was still evolving without building a new ride. So the Fantasyland Theater became both a community stage and a clever piece of marketing. Disneyland in its opening years was smart, resourceful, and very Walt. Even after he was gone, his team kept using Disneyland as a media platform, not just to entertain guests, but to keep the dream alive, one weekend festival at a time. For all its clever marketing and community events, the Fantasyland Theater also had a quiet side, and it turned out to be one of Walt Disney's favorite places to visit inside of the park. Guests would sometimes be standing outside, reading the posters or deciding whether to duck in for a few cartoons, when a familiar voice would be heard right next to them. They'd turn around and there he was, Walt Disney himself, smiling, unhurried. It seemed like he was never in a rush to go anywhere, because he was always exactly where he wanted to be. Kids would obviously rush to see the characters, but for adults, getting to see Walt was amazing, and he could a handshake, even better. He loved to linger around and actually be a guest inside of his own park. And slipping into the theater was allegedly one of his favorite places to go. Inside that small, air-conditioned theater, Walt Disney could disappear. In the dark, he wasn't the boss, the businessman, or the celebrity. He was simply another person watching cartoons. But if he wasn't watching the screen, he was watching the audience, or at least listening to their reactions. That was part of filmmaking Walt had never been able to experience before. When a movie premiered in Hollywood, he was surrounded by critics and executives. When a TV special aired, the reaction was invisible. But at Disneyland, especially in the theater, he could see it firsthand and experience that exact moment when well-crafted punchlines landed. That was the gift of the Mickey Mouse Club Theater, later to be known as the Fantasyland Theater, but not the other Fantasyland Theater. For Walt, it wasn't just a place to show his films. It was a place where he could finally see his films doing what they were meant to do and feel what his dream had become. And friends, this is where our story takes a turn. By the early 1980s, Fantasyland was starting to show its age. The land that once captured the magic of childhood imagination had ironically outgrown its own storybook facade. The plywood banners, the painted flats, the colorful tournament tents, they all carried the charm of 1955, but not the timelessness that Walt Disney had once imagined. When Disneyland opened, Fantasyland was built in less than a year, an all-hands-on-deck scramble to make sure the park could open on time. Ambitiously, it worked, but it wasn't elegant. Behind the castle and carousel, it was still a fairground in disguise, and after 3 decades of weather, wear, and millions of guests, that disguise was starting to peel. That's when Imagineering made the bold decision to completely rebuild Walt's Fantasyland from the ground up. The goal wasn't just to refresh the paint, it was to finally create the old world village that Walt had always envisioned, but due to lack of time and money, couldn't make happen in the original 1-year turnaround to build Disneyland. To construct a place that felt handcrafted, not mass-produced. Instead of carnival tents, there would be timbered roofs, stonework, and chimneys. Instead of rush plywood cutouts, there would be real buildings with depth, shadow, telling you a real story. And Creative Space was absolutely worthy of being called a Fantasyland because it was transformative. No way did you feel like you were still inside of Anaheim, California anymore. It was called New Fantasyland, but it instantly felt like it had always been there. And that is the best kind of design, the kind you never notice. It's so natural, you can't imagine the park without it, or like it hasn't been that way since the gates opened. One of the biggest changes came with the removal of the Mickey Mouse Club Theater, later known as the Fantasyland Theater. Back in the 50s, it made perfect sense. Most Americans didn't have a color television, and the idea of watching Disney cartoons on a big screen inside of Disneyland was still thrilling. This was a place where families could experience the animation that inspired the park itself. But by the early 80s, times had changed. Home video, cable television, the Disney Channel, and new entertainment options made this kind of attraction feel dated. Still, its removal wasn't just a demolition. It was a respectful farewell to a piece of Disneyland's early DNA. And in its place, Imagineers created something that both honored the past and propelled the park forward. Pinocchio's daring journey and the Village House restaurant. Pinocchio was more than a new ride. It was the fulfillment of an idea Walt had wanted from the very beginning. A Pinocchio Square that never materialized in 1955 because the park ran out of both time and money. The two things every creative is always fighting. Glad to know that Walt was in the exact same boat. So in a sense, New Fantasyland gave Walt a second chance. The architecture, the colors, even the layout felt like something he would have approved himself. Ask most guests today, and they'll probably tell you Pinocchio has been there. Ask most guests today, and they'll probably tell you that Pinocchio has been there since day one. That is how seamless Tony Baxter's design really was. In the Village House, today the Red Rose Tavern, Imagineers solved another problem: how to handle the growing number of guests hungry for a break inside of Fantasyland. The restaurant added much needed seating and improved flow through the land and helped crowd control, looking like a European tavern, but working more like another hub, a gathering spot to hold people to keep all the other thoroughfares a little bit more clear. But the transformation of Fantasyland wasn't just about aesthetics. While Baxter and his team were creating a storybook beauty above ground, another group was designing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity while the whole thing was ripped up. Because the demolition of the original theater gave Disneyland builders a rare opportunity. Open the land, clear it for deep construction in the very heart of the park. And when you give Imagineers that kind of blank canvas, they just don't think about what guests will see, they think about how the entire land can work better behind the scenes. And this is where our story takes its next turn. Because the removal didn't just make room for Pinocchio and Village House, it also made room for something else. Most guests walk through this part of Fantasyland without realizing that they're standing on one of the most mysterious pieces in Fantasyland's design. Now, if you pay attention on your next visit, the courtyard outside of the castle is completely flat. But once you go past Snow White, you'll start to realize that there's actually a grade in the land that slopes all the way up till it gets over to Pinocchio. Then it levels off a little bit. That's officially when you're standing on top of the control center for Fantasyland. Because right beneath your feet, under Pinocchio's daring journey, and then Village House, sits something that shouldn't exist here at all. One of Fantasyland's best kept design secrets. Back in 1982, when Imagineers demolished the old Mickey Mouse Club Theater, the plan wasn't just to rebuild Fantasyland's storybook charm. They were about to go much deeper than that. Here's the old theater stripped down to the steel, and look at the ground around it. The dirt drops several feet below the original floor line. And keep in mind, being a theater, the floor line already had a downward grade, but nowhere near what we're getting ready to see. That wasn't grading for landscaping, it was the start of an excavation. From the skyway above, the scale becomes obvious. That's not a shallow footing, it's a full construction pit. Disney was digging for something beneath Fantasyland. This is where this gets not only interesting, but a very unique feature for Disneyland. Workers line the pit with waterproof sheeting and rebar, exactly what you would do if you were about to seal below. You'd only go to this trouble if you needed to keep something dry. And we can actually see in motion. A guest riding the Skyway back in '82 caught this on VHS. Shaky but priceless, the camera glides over the carousel and right into the excavation as it's happening. The clean vertical wall, the flat dirt floor, the sheer depth, it's all there. Proof that Disney wasn't just building up Fantasyland, they were building down. From the deck of Captain Hook's pirate ship, guests could see it too. Concrete walls, 10 to 12 feet tall, braced and poured in place. The kind of structure you'd expect under a corporate headquarters, not a children's dark ride. These weren't temporary forms, they were permanent walls for a real enclosed space. Once the walls cured, the pit was capped with concrete. Conduit pipes rose from below, electrical, audio, and air systems that would power the rides above. Then came the show building, and beneath them, a sealed floor that never saw daylight again. According to Imagineering records and cast member accounts, this hidden level became a small operations hub. Hidden offices, storage rooms, a break space, and even the control room that runs audio and ride systems. It's one of the very few basements inside of Disneyland, and the only one inside of the original Fantasyland. You see, back in 1955, there were very few underground structures. Don't get confused with Walt Disney World. With all of its underground build-outs, at Disneyland, there are few and far between, which is why it's always so exciting when we get to discover a new one together. Watch this video next to discover what's hiding below Town Square. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you.